Billionaire fired 7 maids in a month. Until his autistic son finally felt at ease, he breaks down. Mr. Whitmore, I can't do this anymore. The 7th maid in 30 days stood frozen in the doorway of the playroom, her hands trembling as she clutched her purse like a shield. Across the room, 5-year-old George Whitmore rocked violently on the floor. His small hands pressed so hard against his ears that his knuckles had turned white. The sound coming from him wasn't quite a scream. It was something more primal, a keening that seemed to come from somewhere deep and unreachable. Jason Whitmore, one of the most powerful men in San Francisco's tech industry, a man who'd negotiated billion-dollar deals without flinching, stood utterly helpless in his own home. His tie was loosened, his usually perfect hair disheveled from running his hands through it too many times. "Please." Jason's voice cracked in a way it never did in boardrooms. "Just give it one more day. I'll double your salary. Triple it." "It's not about the money, sir." The woman, Carol, backed toward the hallway. "Your son needs professional help. Real help. I'm just a housekeeper. Yesterday he threw a plate at my head because I moved his trucks 2 inches to the left. 2 inches. I have children of my own to think about. I'm sorry. I really am." She didn't wait for a response. The sound of the front door closing echoed through the marble halls like a judge's gavel. Jason sank against the wall, sliding down until he was sitting on the floor, his expensive suit crumpling beneath him. Across the room, George continued to rock, lost in a world his father couldn't enter no matter how much money he threw at the problem. The boy's dark hair fell across his face, hiding eyes that rarely met anyone's gaze anymore. Not since she died. 14 months. It had been 14 months since Sarah's funeral, and Jason had watched his son slip further away with each passing day. First, George stopped speaking. Then he stopped responding to his name. Now, he barely acknowledged that other people existed at all, except to protest when they invaded the carefully constructed order of his world. 7 maids. 7 failures. 7 more cracks in Jason's already shattered heart. He pulled out his phone with shaking hands and dialed the staffing agency, the one that specialized in, how had they put it, challenging placements. The woman who answered sounded tired even before Jason explained he needed an 8th attempt. "Mr. Whitmore," she sighed. "We've sent you our best people. Then send me someone else. Anyone else. Please." From across the room, George's keening had faded to a whisper. But he was still rocking, still lost, still locked behind walls that Jason's billions couldn't break down. The clock on the wall ticked toward midnight. Another day ending in failure. Another night of sleeping in the chair outside his son's room, afraid of what the morning might bring. Welcome back, my lovely family, to another incredibly heartwarming story. I trust everyone is doing great. If you're new here, please hit the subscribe button now so you don't get to miss the next story. Also remember to hit the notification icon bell so you don't miss the remaining part of this highly emotional and intriguing story. As always, I pray this heartwarming story brings you good fortune. The morning after Carol walked out, Jason Whitmore stood in his corner office 40 stories above San Francisco, staring at a city he'd conquered but couldn't seem to live in anymore. His reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows showed a man who looked a decade older than his 40 years. The bags under his eyes had become permanent fixtures, dark reminders of the countless nights spent listening to his son cry out for a mother who would never answer. His phone buzzed with its endless parade of demands. Board meetings, investor calls, product launches. The machinery of his empire, Whitmore Technologies, churned forward with ruthless efficiency. Jason had built this company from a college dorm room into a $10 billion juggernaut. He'd revolutionized cloud computing. He'd been on the cover of Forbes 3 times. Yet here he stood, defeated by the one thing that mattered more than all of it combined. He couldn't help his own son. The failures played in his mind like a brutal highlight reel. Maid number 1, Patricia, had lasted 5 days before George's meltdown over a changed breakfast routine sent her running. She'd been a grandmother, patient and kind, with 30 years of childcare experience. It hadn't mattered. Maid number 2, a younger woman named Jennifer who specialized in special needs children, made it to day 8 before George locked himself in the bathroom for 6 hours. She'd called it quits via text message, unable to even face Jason in person. Number 3 lasted 3 days. Number 4 barely made it through the first. Number 5 showed genuine promise, understanding that George needed consistency, routine, predictability. She'd studied his patterns, learned his triggers. Then she'd accidentally thrown away one of his drawings, a seemingly meaningless scribble of circles and lines. George had screamed for 4 hours straight. She'd apologized profusely as she packed, saying she couldn't bear to cause him that kind of pain again. Number 6 had been a registered nurse with pediatric training. Surely, Jason had thought, someone with medical expertise could bridge the gap. But George didn't need medicine. He needed something Jason couldn't identify, couldn't quantify, couldn't buy. The nurse had been professional to the end, gently suggesting residential care facilities, specialized programs, options that made Jason's stomach turn. His son wasn't going anywhere. They would figure this out. They had to. And then there was Carol. 7 days of seeming stability before yesterday's disaster. 7 days of Jason allowing himself to hope before watching that hope shatter like everything else. The mansion felt different when Jason returned each evening. It had been Sarah's dream home, a sprawling estate in Pacific Heights with a view of the Golden Gate Bridge. She'd spent 2 years designing every detail, every room telling a story of the life she'd imagined for their family. The kitchen where she'd planned to teach George to bake. The garden where she'd wanted to grow vegetables with him. The library where she'd envisioned reading to him every night. Now it was a mausoleum of those dreams. Sarah had been the bridge between Jason's world and George's. She'd understood their son in ways Jason never could. From the moment the pediatrician first suggested autism spectrum disorder when George was 3, Sarah had become an expert. She'd read every book, joined every support group, learned every therapy technique. She'd known that George lined up his toy cars because it gave him a sense of control. She'd understood that his refusal to make eye contact wasn't rudeness but overwhelm. She'd recognized that his silence wasn't defiance but a different way of processing a world that came at him too loud, too bright, too fast. And then, 14 months ago, a routine checkup had revealed stage 4 pancreatic cancer. 6 weeks later, she was gone. Jason had been in Tokyo closing a merger deal when she'd gotten the diagnosis. He'd flown back immediately, of course, but those lost days haunted him. He'd been in Berlin meeting with investors when she'd started chemotherapy. He'd been testifying before Congress about data privacy when she'd been too weak to get out of bed. He'd made it home for the end, held her hand as she slipped away, but the guilt of all those moments he'd missed, all those times he'd chosen his empire over his family, it ate at him like acid. George had been 4 when his mother died. He'd stopped speaking 3 days after the funeral. Just stopped. The few words he'd been using, the precious mama and more and truck, they vanished as if they'd never existed. His pediatrician said it was regression, common in autistic children experiencing trauma. It would pass, they said. Give him time, they said. But 14 months later, George remained locked in his silence. And Jason, for all his power and resources, had no idea how to reach him. The nights were the hardest. Jason had moved into the chair outside George's bedroom after Sarah died, unable to sleep in their bed, needing to be close in case his son needed him. He'd listen to George's breathing, sometimes peaceful, more often restless. On bad nights, George would wake up crying, searching for his mother, and Jason would sit helplessly outside the door because his son wouldn't let him in. Wouldn't let anyone in. The developmental pediatrician said George's autism made grief more complicated. He couldn't process or express emotions the way neurotypical children could. The loss of his mother, his primary attachment figure, his safe person, it had shattered his already fragile sense of security. Every new caregiver was a reminder that the one person who truly understood him was never coming back. Jason had tried everything money could buy. The best therapists in San Francisco. Applied behavior analysis programs that cost more than most people's houses. Occupational therapy. Speech therapy. Sensory integration therapy. George attended them all with the blank compliance of a prisoner serving a sentence. He went through the motions, but nothing changed. The spark Sarah had carefully nurtured, the little glimpses of connection she treasured, they remained extinguished. The staffing agency called back 2 days after Carol's departure. Jason was in his home office, staring at reports he couldn't focus on, when his phone rang. The voice on the other end belonged to Margaret Stinson, the agency director who'd personally handled his account after the fourth maid quit. She sounded hesitant, which immediately put Jason on edge. Margaret had seen everything in her 30 years placing domestic staff. Nothing made her hesitate. She explained that they had one more candidate, but she wasn't typical of their usual placements. No formal training in special needs care. No college degree. No references from wealthy families. She was young, only 25, and she'd been working minimum wage jobs to support herself while taking community college classes at night. She'd applied to the agency 3 weeks ago, desperate for better paying work. Jason felt his jaw tighten. This was what it had come to. Scraping the bottom of the barrel because no qualified professional would take on the impossible task of caring for his son? But desperation makes people flexible in ways success never does. He told Margaret to send her over for an interview. Her name was Celine Morrison, and she arrived the next morning in a bus because she didn't own a car. Jason watched from his office window as she walked up the long driveway, her posture straight despite carrying a worn backpack that had seen better years. She was black, slender, with her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her clothes were clean but inexpensive, the kind you bought at discount stores because they were all you could afford. Jason met her at the door, and her handshake was firm, her eyes direct. That surprised him. Most people, when confronted with his wealth, either became obsequious or intimidated. Celine Morrison seemed neither. She looked around the entrance hall with its soaring ceilings and original artwork with the analytical gaze of someone taking inventory, not someone overwhelmed by opulence. He found himself explaining George's situation more honestly than he had with the previous candidates. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the certain knowledge that this wouldn't work either. So why bother sugarcoating it? He told her about the autism, the selective mutism, the rigid routines, the sensory sensitivities, the meltdowns that could last hours. He told her 7 people had quit in 30 days. He told her his son couldn't be reached, and he was running out of options and hope in equal measure. Celine listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked one question. Could she meet George? Jason led her upstairs to the playroom, that carefully constructed sanctuary where his son spent most of his waking hours. George was on the floor in his usual spot by the window, arranging his collection of toy cars in perfectly straight lines, organized by color, then by size within each color group. Red cars first, largest to smallest. Then blue. Then yellow. Then green. The same pattern every single day, multiple times a day. Any disruption to this order resulted in immediate distress. Celine stood in the doorway, not entering, just watching. George didn't acknowledge her presence. He rarely acknowledged anything beyond his own carefully controlled environment. She stood there for a full 5 minutes, silent and still, while Jason waited for the inevitable questions, the suggestions, the false promises that she could help. Instead, she turned to Jason and said she'd take the job if he was offering it. She had one condition, though. He had to promise not to hover, not to interfere, not to expect immediate results. She couldn't guarantee anything, but she'd do her best. Her voice carried a quiet certainty that Jason couldn't quite place, a sense that she'd seen hardship before and survived it. He hired her on the spot, though a voice in his head whispered that he was setting them both up for failure. What could this young woman with no credentials possibly do that trained professionals hadn't? But he was wrong about Celine Morrison. He was wrong about almost everything. And it would take him weeks to realize that sometimes the people who understand pain the best are the ones who've lived through it themselves. If this story is already touching something deep in your heart, you're not alone. Thousands of people around the world are finding hope in stories of unexpected connection and healing. Consider subscribing so you never miss these powerful moments that remind us what it means to be human. We share these stories because they matter, because your heart matters. Celine Morrison's first official day began at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday that felt like any other, except it wasn't. Jason found himself watching the security camera feeds from his office, something he'd done with all the previous maids, waiting for the moment when George's world and theirs would collide in disaster. But Celine didn't follow the pattern the others had established. She didn't try to greet George, didn't attempt to engage him in play, didn't use the bright, cheerful voice most caregivers adopted when working with special needs children, that tone that always seemed to make George more agitated. Instead, she moved through the house quietly, familiarizing herself with where things were kept, learning the geography of the Whitmore mansion with methodical patience. She found George's schedule taped to the refrigerator, Sarah's handwriting still visible on the laminated pages. Breakfast at 7:30 a.m., always the same meal. Blueberry waffles cut into 4 equal squares, no syrup, arranged in a specific pattern on a blue plate. The same blue plate every time. Playtime from 8 to 10 o'clock, during which he was not to be disturbed unless there was danger. Snack at 10:15, apple slices arranged like a fan. The schedule continued through the entire day, every moment accounted for, every activity predicted, because unpredictability was George's enemy. Celine studied that schedule like it was scripture. She took notes in a small spiral notebook she kept in her pocket, writing down observations in neat, precise handwriting. The way George lined his cars. The fact that he only wore shirts with no tags because tags felt like knives against his skin. The specific route he walked through the house, always the same path, stepping over the same spots on the hardwood floors. How he covered his ears when the refrigerator hummed. How he rocked when overwhelmed. How his breathing changed when he was approaching a meltdown. She didn't try to change any of it. She just watched, learned, and respected the boundaries George had built around himself. Jason found it unnerving. The other maids had tried to help immediately, implementing strategies and interventions, attempting to break through George's walls with therapeutic techniques and behavioral modifications. Celine just existed. She was there, quiet and present, but not intrusive. She never touched George's things without carefully returning them to their exact positions. She never spoke to him directly, sensing somehow that direct attention felt like assault to his nervous system. On her third day, Jason broke his promise not to interfere. He found Celine in the kitchen during George's afternoon quiet time, preparing his snack with the meticulous precision the schedule demanded. He'd meant to check in professionally, but his curiosity got the better of him. He asked about her background, where she'd learned to be so patient, why she'd taken a job caring for a child no one else could reach. Celine's hands paused over the apple she was slicing. For a moment, Jason thought she wouldn't answer. Then she told him, her voice steady but carrying weight, that she'd grown up in the foster care system. 12 different homes before she aged out at 18. She'd learned early that survival meant being invisible, reading rooms, understanding unspoken rules. You developed patience when you had no power, when you were always the outsider trying to find your place. She had a younger foster brother once, she said. Marcus. He'd been 7 when they were placed together in a group home. Both of them part of the system's forgotten children. Marcus had been different, she explained. He'd flap his hands when excited. He'd only eat certain foods. He'd have meltdowns that the staff called tantrums, but Celine recognized as something else, something deeper. The system hadn't known what to do with a kid like Marcus. They'd moved him to a specialized facility when she was 16. She'd lost track of him after that. The system scattered children like seeds in the wind, and you rarely knew where they landed. But she'd spent 2 years learning how to communicate with Marcus, how to exist in his world instead of forcing him into hers. She'd learned that sometimes the quietest presence was the loudest love. Jason stood in his kitchen, this temple of marble and high-end appliances, and realized he'd been fundamentally wrong. Credentials didn't matter. Degrees didn't matter. What mattered was understanding. And Celine Morrison understood his son in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. He asked, his voice rough with emotion he rarely allowed himself to show, if she'd ever found out what happened to Marcus. Celine's expression flickered, just for a second, and Jason saw the grief she carried. She said Marcus had died 3 years ago. An accident in the facility. Something about inadequate supervision during a seizure. She'd found out through a social worker's phone call, a clinical notification of a death that had shattered her heart. She hadn't even been allowed to attend his funeral because, legally, she wasn't family. The system didn't recognize the bonds formed between foster siblings as real kinship. That's why she was here, she told Jason. Because every child deserved someone who saw them, really saw them for who they were. Not as problems to be solved or behaviors to be modified, but as human beings navigating a world that wasn't built for them. Jason left the kitchen feeling like he'd been hollowed out and refilled with something he couldn't name. Shame, maybe. Recognition. Hope. This woman who'd had nothing, who'd lost everything, understood more about love than he'd learned in 40 years of privilege. The week continued in the same quiet pattern. Celine maintained George's routines with religious devotion. She anticipated his needs before they became crises. When the washing machine's spin cycle made George cover his ears and rock, she started doing laundry only during his nap times. When she noticed he calmed down near windows, she rearranged furniture so his play areas always had natural light. Small adjustments, invisible to anyone not paying attention, but they added up to something significant. George still didn't acknowledge her. Still didn't speak, didn't make eye contact, didn't show any sign that he registered her as more than another piece of furniture in his world. But he didn't have meltdowns either. Not one. Not in 7 full days. The house maintained an eerie calm that Jason had forgotten was possible. On day 8, something shifted. Jason was reviewing contracts in his office when he heard something through the baby monitor he kept active throughout the house. Not words. Not even a cry. Just humming. A low melodic sound that seemed to float through the speakers like a ghost. He pulled up the camera feed and saw Celine in the playroom, organizing George's art supplies, putting everything back in its designated place. She was humming while she worked, some tune Jason didn't recognize, maybe gospel or a spiritual, her voice carrying a warmth that seemed to soften the edges of the room. And George, impossibly, hadn't run away. He was still there in his spot by the window with his cars, but his rocking had slowed. His hands, usually pressed against his ears when unexpected sounds occurred, lay relaxed in his lap. He wasn't looking at Celine, but he wasn't fleeing from her either. It was the smallest thing, meaningless to anyone else. But to Jason it was a miracle. He watched his son sit in the same room as another human being without distress, and something inside his chest cracked open. Hope, that dangerous thing he'd learned to suppress, started seeping through the cracks. Celine finished organizing and left the room as quietly as she'd worked, never pushing for more, never demanding acknowledgement, just existing alongside George in his carefully constructed world, respecting his boundaries while gently making her presence known. That night, after George was asleep and Celine was preparing to leave for the day, Jason stopped her at the door. He thanked her, his voice thick with emotion he didn't try to hide anymore. He said he didn't know what she was doing, but whatever it was, please keep doing it. Celine smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her, and told him she wasn't doing anything special. She was just paying attention. Sometimes, she said, that was enough. Sometimes, being seen was the first step toward healing. Jason stood in his doorway long after her bus pulled away, thinking about all the things money couldn't buy. Understanding, patience, the kind of empathy that came from surviving your own darkness. Celine Morrison had walked into his home with nothing but a backpack and a bus pass, and she was giving his son something priceless. She was giving him space to exist exactly as he was. The breakthrough happened on a Thursday morning during George's playtime. 2 weeks after Celine had started, Jason had stopped watching the cameras obsessively, learning to trust that his son was safe, that Celine wouldn't push too hard or give up too easily. But something made him check the feed that morning, some instinct he couldn't name. What he saw stopped his heart. George was sitting on the floor with his cars, same as always, arranging them in his precise patterns. But Celine had moved closer than she ever had before, sitting about 6 feet away, close enough to be present but far enough to not invade his space. She was folding laundry, creating her own patterns with towels and sheets, and she was humming again. That same melody from before, low and soothing. And George, his beautiful, unreachable son, had turned his head slightly in her direction. It wasn't eye contact. It wasn't even close to normal interaction. But it was acknowledgement, the first genuine awareness Jason had seen George show toward another person since Sarah's death. His son knew Celine was there, and for once he didn't mind. Jason's hand shook as he gripped his desk. He wanted to run to the playroom to witness this miracle up close, but he forced himself to stay still. This moment belonged to Celine and George. He was just a witness to something profound unfolding in real time. Celine kept humming, her hands moving through the laundry with practiced ease. She started singing words softly, so quietly the microphone barely picked them up. Something about walking through valleys, about fear and comfort, about goodness and mercy. A hymn, maybe, or a spiritual song her grandmother had taught her. The melody wrapped around the room like a blanket. George's rocking slowed until it stopped completely. His hands, always moving, always stimmying, fell still in his lap. He was listening, truly listening, his head tilted at that particular angle that meant he was processing something important. Then, slowly, impossibly, George picked up one of his red cars and moved it toward Celine's folded laundry. Not close enough to touch the towels, but closer than he'd ever voluntarily moved toward another person. It was an offering, a gesture, a bridge built from a single toy car spanning an impossible distance. Celine's hands stilled on the towel she was folding. She didn't reach for the car, didn't exclaim or react with the excitement most people couldn't contain. She just looked at it, then at George, and smiled so gently it was barely there. She said thank you in a voice soft as rainfall. Just that. 2 words acknowledging the gift, respecting the enormity of what George had just done. George didn't look at her face. Eye contact was still too much, too intense, too overwhelming. But he didn't take the car back either. It stayed there, a red plastic bridge between 2 souls learning to exist in the same space. Jason watched through the camera with tears streaming down his face, not bothering to wipe them away. In his entire life, he'd closed billion-dollar deals, addressed thousands of employees, been interviewed by major news outlets without ever losing his composure. But watching his silent son reach toward another human being for the first time in over a year absolutely destroyed him. The moment didn't last long. George soon returned to his patterns, the car reclaimed and placed back in its designated position in the line. But something fundamental had shifted. The wall between George and the world had developed its first crack, and Celine Morrison had been the gentle force that created it. That evening, after George was in bed, Jason asked Celine to stay for dinner. Not as an employee, but as he didn't know what to call her. A friend. A lifeline. The person who'd given him something to hope for again. They sat in the kitchen, this vast space designed for entertaining that had seen only silence since Sarah's death, and ate Thai takeout from containers because Jason couldn't remember the last time anyone had cooked a real meal in this house. Celine talked about her day, about noticing that George responded better to certain tones, certain rhythms. She'd been experimenting with different songs, different melodies, finding the ones that soothed him most. Jason found himself confessing things he'd never told anyone. The guilt that consumed him. How he'd been in Berlin when Sarah got her diagnosis. How he'd promised to slow down, to be more present, but the company always needed something, and he'd convinced himself he was providing for his family by building this empire. How he'd missed so many moments he could never get back, chasing success while the people he loved needed him most. How George had been speaking before Sarah died. Just a few words, but they were there. Mama. Dada. Truck. More. Yes. No. A limited vocabulary. But communication nonetheless. And Jason had been so focused on wanting George to speak in full sentences, to be normal, that he'd never fully appreciated the miracle of those small words. Now they were gone, and he'd give anything to hear his son say "dada" just one more time. Celine listened without judgment, her dark eyes reflecting understanding that came from her own scars. She told him about the guilt she carried over Marcus, how she'd aged out of foster care and gotten her own apartment, working multiple jobs to survive, how she'd meant to stay in touch with her foster brother to visit him, but life got hard and busy, and suddenly months had passed without contact. Then came the call about his death, and all her intentions meant nothing. She said grief and guilt were twins, always traveling together. You couldn't grieve someone without questioning what you could have done differently. But Marcus's death wasn't her fault, and Sarah's death wasn't Jason's fault. Cancer didn't care about anyone's schedule or intentions. Sometimes terrible things just happened, and surviving them meant learning to forgive yourself for being human. Jason realized he was crying again, this powerful man who'd forgotten how to let himself be vulnerable, falling apart in his kitchen in front of a woman he'd known for 2 weeks. Celine didn't look away, didn't offer empty platitudes, just let him break, understanding that sometimes breaking was necessary before healing could begin. She said something that night that Jason would remember for the rest of his life. She said George hadn't stopped speaking because he was autistic. He'd stopped speaking because his whole world had shattered when his mother died, and words weren't big enough to hold that kind of pain. But silence was. Silence was vast enough to contain everything he couldn't express. And maybe, someday when he felt safe enough, when he found someone who understood his language, he'd choose to speak again. But even if he didn't, even if George remained nonverbal for the rest of his life, that didn't make him less valuable, less worthy of love, less fully human. He was already complete exactly as he was. The world needed to change to meet him, not the other way around. The days that followed built on that first breakthrough. George began tolerating Celine's presence more consistently. He still didn't make eye contact, still didn't speak, still lived inside his carefully constructed routines. But he allowed her closer. 6 feet became 5 feet. 5 feet became 4. Small increments that represented enormous trust for a child who found the world overwhelming and dangerous. Celine discovered that George loved patterns in music. Not just any music but specific types. Classical pieces with clear mathematical structures. Bach's compositions especially. All that precise order and predictable progression. She started playing them softly during his playtime, and George's whole body would relax, his rocking taking on the rhythm of whatever piece was playing. She noticed he was fascinated by water. Not drinking it or playing in it but watching it move. The way rain ran down windows in rivulets. How light reflected off the surface of his water glass. The patterns created by the pool in the backyard. So she started incorporating water into his environment carefully. A small fountain in the corner of the playroom. The sound constant and soothing. A prism hanging in the window, creating rainbow patterns when the sun hit it just right. George began to thrive in ways so subtle that only someone paying close attention would notice. His meltdowns, never frequent with Celine but still occasional, became even rarer. His sleep improved. He started eating slightly more varied foods, not much, but accepting that the blueberry waffles could be on a different colored plate sometimes without the world ending. Jason watched all of this unfold and felt something he'd thought he'd lost forever. Not just hope but joy. Actual joy at seeing his son engaged with life, even in George's unique way. He started coming home earlier, rearranging meetings, delegating more to his executive team. The company would survive without him micromanaging every decision. His son might not. Stories like these remind us that healing doesn't always look the way we expect. Sometimes it's quiet, subtle, built from small moments of understanding between broken people finding their way toward wholeness. If these stories are resonating with you, if they're reminding you that hope can be found in the most unexpected places, join our community by subscribing. Let's hold space together for the beautiful, messy reality of being human. Drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. It happened 3 weeks into Celine's employment, late on a Friday night when the world was quiet and guards were down. Jason was working late in his office, chasing the time zone differences that kept him tethered to global markets. Around 11, he realized he hadn't checked on George in hours. Bad habit from the old days when maids were temporary and trust was impossible. He walked toward George's room, intending just to peek in, to reassure himself his son was sleeping peacefully. But as he approached, he heard something that made him freeze in the hallway. Singing. That same melody Celine hummed during the day, but with words now full and clear. Her voice carried through George's partially open door, rich with emotion and memory. A spiritual about troubled waters and carrying someone home. About walking through darkness and finding light on the other side. Jason moved closer and looked through the crack in the door. The sight that greeted him rewrote everything he thought he understood about connection and care. George was in bed, but not asleep. He was curled on his side, and Celine was sitting in the chair beside him. The one Jason had slept in for months after Sarah died. She was singing softly, and George's hand, his small 5-year-old hand that never voluntarily touched anyone, was resting on her arm. Not gripping. Not clinging. Just resting there. Anchored to another human being by choice. Jason's knees nearly gave out. His son was touching someone. Seeking comfort. Accepting the presence of another person not just in his space but in his immediate physical proximity. It was impossible. It was miraculous. It was everything he'd prayed for during countless sleepless nights. Celine's voice cracked slightly on the words, and Jason realized she was crying while she sang. Quiet tears running down her face, her free hand wiping them away so they wouldn't fall on George and disturb him. She was pouring everything into this moment, all her own grief for Marcus, all her understanding of what it meant to be a child who needed someone to witness their pain. The song ended, and Celine started to carefully extract her arm, trying not to wake George or break whatever spell had allowed this connection. But as she moved, George made a sound. Not a word, but a small noise of protest, of wanting her to stay. And Celine stayed. Jason watched her settle back into the chair, watched his son's breathing even out into sleep with his hand still resting on her arm, and something inside him completely shattered. All his walls, all his carefully maintained composure, all the armor he'd built to survive running a company and losing his wife and failing his son, it all came crashing down. He must have made some sound because Celine's head turned toward the door. She saw him standing there, saw the devastation on his face, and very carefully stood up, tucking George's hand back under his blanket without waking him. She slipped out of the room, closing the door softly, and found Jason collapsed against the hallway wall, his shoulders shaking with sobs he couldn't control. She didn't say anything, didn't try to comfort him with words, just sat down on the floor beside him, this billionaire and this housekeeper, and let him break. When Jason could finally speak, the words tumbled out in a flood. Everything he'd been holding back, every failure, every regret, every moment of inadequacy. How he'd failed Sarah by not being there enough. How he was failing George every single day. How he didn't know how to be a father to a child he couldn't reach. How watching Celine connect with his son made him feel grateful and devastated in equal measure because she could do what he couldn't. He confessed that he'd been prejudiced when he'd first met her, had doubted her because of her age, her lack of credentials, her background, had hired her out of desperation, not faith, and she'd proven him wrong in every possible way. She was saving his son while he, with all his resources and power, had been completely useless. Celine let him purge it all, let him empty himself of every poisonous thought, before she finally spoke. Her voice was quiet but steady, carrying the weight of someone who'd survived her own demons. She told him he wasn't useless. He was human. And being human meant making mistakes, carrying guilt, struggling with things money couldn't fix. She said George knew his father loved him, even if Jason couldn't see it. Children understood love in ways that transcended words and typical interaction. George felt safe in this house, secure in his routines, because Jason had created that stability. That mattered more than Jason realized. She told him about the guilt she carried over Marcus, how she'd worked herself to exhaustion those first years after aging out of foster care, trying to build some kind of life, how she'd meant to visit Marcus to stay connected, but the weight of survival had crushed those intentions, how she'd gotten the call about his death while working a late shift at a fast food restaurant, and she'd had to finish her shift because she couldn't afford to lose the job. How she'd cried in a bathroom stall during her break, grieving alone because she had no one, absolutely no one, who understood what Marcus had meant to her. She said guilt was a hungry thing. It would eat you alive if you let it. But Marcus's death wasn't her fault, and Sarah's death wasn't Jason's fault, and sometimes you had to forgive yourself for being imperfect in an imperfect world. What mattered now was showing up, being present, giving George what he needed in this moment, not torturing yourself over moments already past. They sat in that hallway for over an hour, two people from completely different worlds discovering they spoke the same language of loss and hope. Jason learned more about Celine that night, about the group homes where she'd never felt safe, about the foster parents who'd taken her in for the monthly check but never really saw her as a child who needed love, about how Marcus had been the first person who felt like real family, and losing him had nearly destroyed her. But it hadn't destroyed her. She'd survived. She'd kept going. She'd taken classes and worked multiple jobs and refused to let her circumstances define her forever. She'd found purpose in helping others, in being the person for other children that she'd wished someone had been for her and Marcus. Jason realized, sitting there in his mansion that suddenly felt less empty, that Celine Morrison was one of the strongest people he'd ever met. Not because she'd overcome obstacles, though she had, but because she'd chosen to transform her pain into purpose, to let her own suffering make her more compassionate rather than more bitter. She'd earned wisdom the hard way, and she was using it to heal a child who desperately needed exactly what she had to offer. He asked, his voice rough with emotion, if she resented him. His wealth. His privilege. The fact that he'd had every advantage she'd been denied and still couldn't help his own son. Celine shook her head. She said resentment was too heavy to carry. She'd tried it for a while, being angry at the world for dealing her such a terrible hand. But anger didn't change anything. It just made the load heavier. So she'd put it down and focused on what she could control, her choices, her responses, her determination to show up every day and try to do something good. She said George was teaching her as much as she was teaching him. He was showing her that connection didn't have to look conventional to be real. That communication went deeper than words. That accepting someone exactly as they were, without needing them to change to make you comfortable, that was the purest form of love. Jason looked at this 25-year-old woman who'd lived more life than most people twice her age, and felt humbled. She'd walked into his home with nothing and given him everything, a way forward, a reason to hope, a model for how to love his son not despite his autism but including it, honoring it, respecting it as part of who George fundamentally was. When they finally stood up, stiff from sitting on the floor, Jason did something he hadn't done since Sarah died. He hugged someone. Really hugged them. And Celine hugged him back, this unlikely pair finding comfort in their shared commitment to the child sleeping behind the door. Things shifted after that night. Not just between Jason and Celine, but in the entire dynamic of the household. Jason stopped hiding in his office. Stopped using work as an escape from his inadequacy as a father. He started learning from Celine, watching how she moved through George's world, how she anticipated needs without being intrusive, how she respected boundaries while still being present. He learned that George communicated constantly, just not with words. The way he lined up his cars told stories. The intensity of his rocking indicated his stress level. The specific toys he chose reflected his emotional state. Jason had been so focused on the words his son didn't say that he'd missed the volumes George spoke every day through action and pattern. Celine taught him to exist alongside George rather than constantly trying to engage him. To be a peaceful presence rather than a demanding one. To measure success not in eye contact or spoken words, but in the relaxation of George's shoulders, the softness of his breathing, the gradual increase in his tolerance for unpredictability. But peace never lasts forever. 3 days after that hallway conversation, Jason's mother arrived for her monthly visit, and everything began to unravel. Margaret Whitmore had been a force of nature in Jason's life, a society matriarch who'd raised him to value propriety, success, and maintaining appropriate boundaries. She'd loved Sarah, truly loved her, but had never quite understood George's diagnosis. She saw it as something to be fixed rather than accommodated, treated rather than accepted. She arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in her chauffeur-driven car, dressed in expensive neutrals, carrying gifts George would never play with because they required social interaction he couldn't give. Jason tried to intercept her, to prepare her for the changes in the household. But Margaret Whitmore was not someone who could be intercepted. She swept into the house and immediately noticed Celine playing classical music in the background while George arranged his cars. Margaret's expression tightened in that way that meant she was displeased but maintaining civility. She greeted George effusively, hugging him when he clearly signaled his discomfort, talking to him in that bright, loud voice that made him cover his ears. Celine gently suggested that George responded better to quiet tones, and Margaret's attention swung to her like a weapon. Over dinner that night, after George was in bed, Margaret interrogated Celine with questions disguised as polite interest. Her credentials, her training, her background, each answer revealing exactly what Margaret had suspected. that this housekeeper had no business caring for a child with George's needs. Jason tried to intervene, explaining how much progress George had made, how Celine understood his son in ways no trained professional had. But Margaret was relentless. She pointed out that George needed occupational therapy, speech therapy, behavioral intervention from licensed providers, not folk wisdom from someone whose only qualification was surviving a difficult childhood. The racism was subtle but unmistakable. Comments about finding someone more suitable, about the kind of environment we want George exposed to, about maintaining certain standards. Never explicit enough to be called out directly, but clear enough that everyone at the table understood exactly what she meant. Celine excused herself early, claiming exhaustion, but Jason saw the hurt in her eyes as she left. Margaret watched her go and turned to her son with that look that had gotten him through Harvard, that had pushed him to build his empire, that had never accepted anything less than perfection. She told him this situation was inappropriate, that people would talk, that George needed real help, not some unqualified young woman playing caregiver, that Jason had responsibilities to his son's future, to his social standing, to the family name. And in a moment of weakness, a moment where years of conditioning overwhelmed weeks of growth, Jason felt himself waver. Before we continue this journey together, I want to pause and acknowledge how these real human struggles resonate with all of us. Sometimes the hardest battles aren't against external obstacles but against our own fears and prejudices. If you're finding value in these stories of imperfect people trying to do better, trying to love harder, consider subscribing to join thousands of others who believe healing is possible. We're building something special here, a community that holds space for hard truths and beautiful redemptions. Your support means everything. Jason didn't sleep that night. He lay in his bed, Sarah's side still mostly empty except for the pillow he sometimes held, and wrestled with the worst parts of himself. Margaret's words echoed in his head, mixing with his own insecurities, creating a poisonous cocktail of doubt. What if he was being irresponsible? What if Celine's approach, as effective as it seemed, wasn't enough? What if George needed more than empathy and understanding? What if Jason was choosing comfort over what was truly best for his son? The questions spiraled through his mind like vultures, picking at every insecurity he'd ever harbored about his ability to be a good father. Margaret had planted seeds in soil already fertile with self-doubt, and by morning, those seeds had grown into something monstrous. He made the decision on Wednesday morning, standing in his bathroom mirror, forcing himself to believe he was doing the right thing even as everything in his gut screamed that he was making a catastrophic mistake. He would let Celine go. He would hire the developmental specialist his mother had recommended, someone with degrees from prestigious universities, someone from their social circle who understood proper boundaries and professional distance. He would do what responsible parents were supposed to do, even if it tore him apart. Celine arrived at 7 as always, her smile warm despite yesterday's uncomfortable dinner. Jason met her at the door and asked if they could talk before she started her day. Something in his tone must have warned her because her expression shifted, that openness closing down into something guarded, protective. They sat in the living room, this showcase space that had never felt like a real room where real people had real conversations, and Jason delivered his rehearsed speech. He thanked her for everything she'd done, acknowledged the progress George had made, but explained that he'd been consulting with specialists who felt George needed more structured intervention, more therapeutic approaches that Celine wasn't qualified to provide. He offered her 3 months severance pay, a glowing reference, his gratitude and best wishes, everything except the truth, which was that he was choosing his mother's approval over his son's well-being because old patterns were easier than new growth, and he was too afraid to be the person this situation required him to be. Celine listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked one question, her voice steady but her eyes bright with unshed tears. Did he really believe George would be better off without her? Or was he making this decision for other reasons? Jason couldn't answer. The words stuck in his throat because he knew, God, he knew this was wrong. But he'd already committed to this path, already let his mother's voice drown out his own instincts, and backing down now felt impossible. Celine stood up slowly, dignified in her devastation. She said she understood, that she'd known from the beginning this position was temporary, that someone like her didn't belong in a world like his. She just hoped George might be different, that his needs might transcend the boundaries society drew between people like her and people like Jason. She'd been wrong. She saw that now. Jason wanted to take it back, wanted to tell her she was right. He was wrong, please stay. But his mouth wouldn't form the words. Years of conditioning, of prioritizing propriety over authenticity, of choosing comfort over courage, they held his tongue hostage. Celine went upstairs to say goodbye to George. Jason followed at a distance, hating himself more with every step. She found George in the playroom with his cars, his world perfectly ordered, safe because she'd made it safe. She knelt down a few feet away from him, respecting his boundaries one last time. She told him she had to go away, that she wouldn't be coming back, that someone new would be taking care of him, and she hoped he'd be gentle with them, give them a chance to understand his language. She told him he was special. Not broken, not less than, but beautifully unique in a world that needed more people like him. She told him his mother would be proud of who he was becoming. George didn't look at her, didn't respond in any way that Jason could see. But his rocking intensified, his breathing changed, and Jason recognized the signs of an oncoming meltdown. Celine stood up, tears finally falling, and walked out of the playroom. She collected her worn backpack from the kitchen, that same bag she'd carried on her first day, now leaving with nothing more than she'd arrived with except a broken heart and a check she'd probably never cash. Jason watched her walk down the driveway from his office window, and he felt like the worst kind of coward. She'd been right about everything. She belonged in George's life more than the specialists and therapists. But he'd let fear win, let prejudice and social pressure dictate choices that would hurt the people he cared about most. The meltdown started 5 minutes after Celine left. George's keening filled the house, that primal sound of anguish that Jason had learned to dread. He rushed to the playroom and found his son in full crisis, rocking violently, hands pressed to his ears, tears streaming down his face. Jason tried everything. The calming techniques the therapists had taught him, the sensory tools, the quiet voice. Nothing worked. George was inconsolable, lost in a grief he couldn't express, crying out for a connection that had been ripped away without his consent. The meltdown lasted 4 hours. 4 hours of Jason watching his son suffer, knowing he'd caused this pain, unable to fix what he'd broken. When George finally exhausted himself and fell into a restless sleep, Jason sat on the playroom floor surrounded by scattered toy cars and felt like the ground had opened up beneath him. The next 3 days were hell. George stopped eating. He'd accept a few bites of waffle in the morning, nothing else. His sleep disintegrated into fitful naps interrupted by crying. He searched the house constantly, checking every room, looking for someone who wasn't there. The routines that had brought him comfort became compulsive, desperate attempts to control a world that had suddenly become unpredictable and dangerous again. Jason hired the specialist his mother recommended, a woman with impressive credentials and zero ability to connect with George. She tried to implement structured behavioral interventions, and George shut down completely, stopped responding to anything, retreated so far into himself that Jason feared he'd never come back. The specialist quit after 2 days, gently suggesting that George might benefit from a more intensive residential program, somewhere he could get round-the-clock care from professionals who weren't emotionally invested in his progress. She meant an institution. She was suggesting Jason send his 5-year-old son to live somewhere else because caring for him was too difficult. Jason showed her the door. His mother called daily, full of advice and criticism. He stopped answering. His executive team noticed his distraction, the way he cut meetings short to rush home, the haunted look in his eyes. The company's stock dipped slightly as rumors circulated about their CEO's instability. Jason didn't care. He'd built an empire and lost everything that mattered. The irony wasn't lost on him. On the third night, Jason found himself in George's room at 2 a.m, watching his son sleep fitfully, his small face still showing the tracks of earlier tears. Jason had broken something sacred. He'd had a miracle in his hands, a person who understood his son's language, who made George feel safe and seen, and he'd thrown it away because he'd been afraid of what other people might think. He'd failed Sarah again. She'd loved George exactly as he was, had fought the whole world to protect him. And Jason had folded at the first sign of social pressure. He thought about Celine, about her strength and grace, about how she'd survived foster care and loss and poverty without becoming bitter. She'd walked into his home and given George something priceless, and Jason had treated her like she was disposable. He'd seen her as the help, not as the help. The realization made him physically sick. He'd harbored the same prejudices he'd been raised with, the subtle racism of assuming someone from Celine's background couldn't possibly be as valuable as someone with the right credentials and the right connections. He'd let society's hierarchies matter more than his son's well-being. Dawn broke on the 4th day, and Jason had an epiphany born of desperation and anguish and finally, clarity. He'd spent his entire adult life making decisions based on what was expected, what was proper, what would maintain his image and status. He'd chosen building his company over being present for his wife's illness. He'd chosen professional achievement over family time. And now he'd chosen social approval over his son's happiness. Every single time, he'd chosen wrong. George deserved better. Deserved a father who had the courage to choose love over fear, connection over convention, authenticity over appearances. And Celine deserved better too. Deserved to be valued for the gift she'd given, not dismissed because she didn't fit someone else's narrow definition of acceptable. Jason looked at his sleeping son and made a promise. No more cowardice. No more letting other people's voices drown out his own instincts. No more choosing the easy path over the right path. He was going to fix this. Whatever it took. Jason started searching for Celine before the sun fully rose. He had her last known address from the employment paperwork, a small apartment in the Tenderloin district, one of San Francisco's roughest neighborhoods. He'd never been to that part of the city, had avoided it the way wealthy people avoided reminders of inequality. Now he was grateful for navigation apps that guided him through unfamiliar streets. He arrived at her building just after 7 a.m, a rundown structure that had probably been beautiful decades ago but now wore its age and neglect like a second skin. No doorman. No security system. Just a heavy door with a broken lock and stairs that creaked under his weight. Celine's apartment was on the 3rd floor. Jason knocked, aware that he probably looked insane, still in yesterday's clothes, unshaven, desperate. No answer. He knocked again, harder. A neighbor cracked their door open, an elderly woman with suspicious eyes. She told him the young lady in 3C had been packing up the past few days. Leaving the city, she'd said. No reason to stay here anymore. Jason felt panic rise in his throat. He asked if the neighbor knew where Celine might be now. The woman shrugged and suggested he try the church down the block. The girl went there sometimes, especially when she was upset. Jason ran. Actually ran down the street, this billionaire in wrinkled clothes sprinting past startled pedestrians, searching for a church he'd never visited, looking for a woman he'd thrown away because he'd been too afraid to fight for what mattered. He found her in a small Baptist church, sitting alone in a back pew, her backpack at her feet. her head bowed in prayer or grief or both. The morning light filtered through simple stained glass windows, casting colored patterns across the worn wooden floors. It was nothing like the grand cathedral where they'd held Sarah's funeral, but somehow it felt more holy, more honest. Jason slid into the pew beside her, and Celine's head lifted. The surprise in her eyes quickly shifted to wariness, that protective shield she'd learned to raise against disappointment. He didn't have a speech prepared this time. No rehearsed words. Just truth, raw and unpolished and long overdue. He told her he'd made a terrible mistake, that he'd let fear and prejudice and other people's expectations dictate a decision that should have been guided by only one thing: what was best for George. And what was best for George was her. It had always been her. He told her about the last 3 days. George's regression. The new specialist who'd quit. His son's desperate search for her in every room. The way George had stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped engaging with a world that no longer felt safe because the one person who understood him was gone. He told her he'd been raised to value certain things, credentials and pedigree and maintaining social boundaries. But those values had cost him everything. His presence during Sarah's illness. His connection with his son. And now almost Celine herself. He said he was done living that way. Done choosing what looked right over what was right. Done letting other people's voices matter more than his own heart. He asked, his voice breaking, if she would consider coming back. Not as an employee. Not as hired help. As family. As the person George needed, the person Jason needed, the person who'd given them both a reason to hope again. He told her he wanted to support her in going to school, getting whatever credentials she wanted, not because she needed them to be valuable, but because she deserved every opportunity to grow. He wanted to compensate her properly for the miracle she'd performed in their lives. He wanted her to know she belonged, truly belonged, in their home and their family. And he apologized for not seeing her worth immediately, for doubting her because of her background, for letting social prejudice cloud his judgment, for hurting her after she'd given so much, for being the kind of man his mother had raised him to be instead of the kind of man his son needed him to become. Celine listened, tears sliding down her face, her hands gripped together in her lap. When Jason finished, she was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with her own fears. She told him she'd packed up her apartment that morning, had accepted a job in another city, working as a home health aide for an elderly couple who needed help. It was a fresh start, a way to leave behind the pain of losing George, of being dismissed by the man she'd thought might be different. She said yes. George had changed her life. She'd poured everything into connecting with him, not just because it was her job, but because loving that child had healed something broken inside her. Something left over from losing Marcus, from never having the chance to say goodbye properly. George had given her a second chance to be there for a child who needed her, and having that ripped away had nearly destroyed her. But here Jason was, asking her to come back, and she didn't know if she could trust that he wouldn't break her heart again. What happened the next time his mother visited? The next time society questioned their arrangement? Would he cave again? Would he choose appearances over authenticity? Jason understood her hesitation. He'd earned her distrust. But he told her about George's face that morning, about the way his son had woken up searching for her, about the tears that seemed endless now. He told her that George needed her in a way that transcended employment or social norms. And he, Jason, needed to learn from her. Needed her to teach him how to be the father George deserved. He wasn't asking her to trust him. Not yet. He was asking her to trust George's need. To trust that the connection she'd built with his son was real and necessary and worth the risk of being hurt again. Celine closed her eyes. Jason could see the war happening inside her, the battle between self-protection and love. He held his breath, aware that this moment would determine everything. When she opened her eyes, she asked one question. If she came back, would he promise to fight for her? To stand up to his mother, to society, to anyone who questioned her place in their family? To choose George's well-being and her dignity over social conventions? Jason promised. On Sarah's memory. On George's future. On everything he'd ever valued. He would fight. He would be different. He would be better. Celine picked up her backpack, that worn bag that had carried her through so many transitions, and stood up. She said she needed to go turn down the other job. That she needed to unpack the few belongings she'd managed to box up. That she needed Jason to understand this was her last chance to give him. If he failed her again, failed George again, she was gone for good. Jason accepted those terms gratefully. One chance was more than he deserved. They drove back to the mansion together, Jason's hands shaking on the steering wheel, Celine silent beside him, both of them nervous about the reunion ahead. George had been alone with a babysitter, another temporary person who didn't understand him, who was probably desperate for their shift to end. They walked into the house, and Jason called out that they were home. The babysitter appeared, looking frazzled and relieved, explaining that George had been inconsolable all morning, refusing to leave his room. Celine dropped her backpack and climbed the stairs, Jason following at a distance, giving her space to have this moment with George. She opened the door to his room and found him in the corner, rocking hard, his face buried in his knees, the picture of a child who'd given up hope that his world would ever feel safe again. She said his name. Just once. Softly. George's head lifted. His eyes, red from crying, focused on her face. For a long moment, he just stared, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing, as if she might disappear if he looked away. Then he did something he'd never done before. He stood up, walked across the room, and reached for her hand. Not a brush. Not an accidental touch. A deliberate, intentional reaching for connection. His small hand grasping hers, holding on like she was the only solid thing in a world that had proven itself unreliable and cruel. Celine dropped to her knees and pulled George into a hug, and miraculously, impossibly, he let her. He leaned into her embrace, his body relaxing for the first time in days, his breathing evening out as he pressed his face against her shoulder. And then, so quietly Jason almost missed it, George whispered one word. Stay. His first spoken word in over a year. His first voluntary communication since his mother's death. One word containing all the longing and fear and hope a child could hold. A word that wasn't just a request but a demand, a plea, a prayer. Stay. Jason's knees gave out. He sank against the doorframe, tears streaming down his face, watching his silent son speak, watching the connection between Celine and George made visible and undeniable. This was real. This was family. Not because of blood or social convention, but because of choice and love and the courage to build something new from broken pieces. Celine looked up at Jason over George's head, her own face wet with tears, and nodded. She was staying. They were all staying. Together they would figure out how to be a family. The months that followed weren't perfect. Healing never is. But they were transformative in ways that changed everyone involved. George began to thrive. Not in the ways traditional therapists measured progress, but in the ways that actually mattered. He started eating better, sleeping through the night again. His meltdowns became rare, reserved for truly overwhelming situations rather than daily occurrences. He began making small attempts at communication, not always words, but sounds, gestures, expressions that Celine and Jason learned to read like a language all their own. He smiled more, laughed sometimes, a beautiful sound that filled the mansion with life it hadn't held since Sarah died. He tolerated changes to his routine better, trusting that Celine would help him navigate unpredictability. He even started accepting physical affection from Jason, allowing his father to sit beside him during playtime, to read books while George lined up his cars, to exist in his space without causing distress. Celine enrolled in online courses in child development and special education, using evenings to study while George slept. Jason covered tuition without hesitation, investing in her future because she'd invested everything in his son's present. She was brilliant, soaking up theory and matching it to the practical wisdom she'd learned through experience. Her professors praised her insight, her ability to see beyond textbook definitions to the real, complex humans their theories attempted to describe. Jason restructured his entire life. He promoted his COO to handle day-to-day operations and stepped back from the constant grind of empire building. He started coming home for dinner every night, being present for George's routines, learning from Celine how to exist in his son's world. He attended webinars on autism, read books about neurodiversity, joined support groups for parents of autistic children. He learned that autism wasn't a tragedy to overcome but a different way of being human, valuable, and complete. That seeking a cure meant rejecting who George fundamentally was. That the goal wasn't to make his son normal, whatever that meant, but to help him be the best version of himself, however that looked. Margaret Whitmore had opinions about all of this. Strong opinions, delivered during increasingly tense phone calls. Jason listened politely and then made his own choices anyway. When she threatened to visit less frequently if Celine remained in the household, Jason told her that was her decision to make, but George's well-being came first. Always. Eventually, Margaret's visits did become less frequent. But strangely, when she did visit, her interactions with George improved. Without her constant presence pressuring him to be different, to perform normalcy, George relaxed around his grandmother. Small moments of connection began to emerge, tentative but real. Margaret even started asking Celine for advice, grudging at first, but gradually more genuine. 6 months after Celine's return, Jason made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. He sat down with his lawyer and asked about adoption procedures, not for a child, but for an adult. He wanted Celine to be legally part of their family, to have the security and belonging that came with official recognition. He presented the idea to her on a Saturday morning, when George was absorbed in his patterns and the house was peaceful. He told her he wanted to honor what she'd become to them. Not an employee, not a temporary presence, but family in the truest sense. He wanted her to have legal rights regarding George's care, to be recognized as an equal partner in raising him, to never have to fear that she could be dismissed or excluded. He was offering her something most people took for granted but that she'd never had, a permanent place to belong. Celine cried when he asked, those healing tears that washed away old wounds. She said yes. Not because of the security, though that mattered, but because these two broken people, this grieving father and his silent son, had become her people. Her family. The place where she finally, after 25 years of foster homes and temporary placements, truly belonged. The legal adoption process took months to complete. Judges questioned the unusual arrangement. Social workers investigated. Jason's lawyers worked overtime to navigate precedent and create legal frameworks for a family structure that didn't fit conventional molds. But eventually it was done. Celine Morrison became Celine Morrison Whitmore, legally bound to this family not by blood but by choice. George gained a guardian who understood him, who spoke his language, who loved him exactly as he was. And Jason, he gained a daughter, a partner in parenting, someone who'd taught him that family was built from courage and compassion, not genetics and social convention. They visited Sarah's grave together to mark the occasion. Jason, Celine, and George, standing together in the cemetery as autumn leaves fell around them. George carried flowers, his small hands gripping the stems carefully. When they reached Sarah's headstone, he placed the flowers at its base with a gentleness that made Jason's heart ache. Celine stood beside George, her hand resting on his shoulder, and spoke to Sarah as if she could hear. She told her about George's progress, about the little ways he was finding to communicate, about how much love he contained even when words failed him. She promised to honor Sarah's memory by caring for her son, not as a replacement. Nobody could ever replace Sarah, but as someone who understood the sacred responsibility of helping George navigate this world. Jason added his own words. He told Sarah he was sorry it had taken him so long to understand what mattered. Sorry he'd failed her in so many ways. But he promised to do better, to be the father and the man she'd believed he could be. He promised to choose love over fear, always, from this day forward. George leaned against Celine, his body relaxed and trusting, and made a small sound, something between a hum and a word, that they'd learned meant contentment. He was okay. In this moment, with these people, he was okay. They stood there together as the sun set over San Francisco, casting long shadows across the cemetery. And for the first time since Sarah's death, Jason felt something other than grief. Not happiness, not yet, but hope. The solid, enduring hope that they would be okay. All of them. Together. The mansion that had been a mausoleum of lost dreams began to feel like a home again. Celine brought life into spaces that had been dark for too long. She played music through rooms that had held only silence. She cooked meals in Sarah's kitchen, not trying to replicate what had been but creating something new and nourishing. She turned one of the spare rooms into a sensory space for George, filled with the textures and sounds and lights that helped him regulate when the world became too much. Jason learned to laugh again. Not the polite chuckle of business meetings, but real laughter, often at his own mistakes as he fumbled through learning to be present, to be vulnerable, to be human in ways success had never required. George's small victories became celebrations. The day he tried a new food without distress. The time he allowed a stranger to speak to him in a store without melting down. The morning he woke up and smiled at Jason first thing, unprompted and genuine. One evening, almost a year after Celine's return, the three of them were in the living room. George was on the floor with his cars, creating increasingly complex patterns that suggested an artistic sensibility beyond simple organization. Celine was grading papers for one of her courses, well on her way to her degree. Jason was reading a book about autism and neurodiversity, finally educating himself about his son's reality. George looked up from his cars and said clearly and deliberately, "Happy." Just that one word. But it contained multitudes. He was happy. Here now with these people who loved him exactly as he was. Happy in a way he hadn't been since his mother died, since his world had shattered and he'd retreated into protective silence. Jason and Celine exchanged looks, their eyes filled with tears and joy and gratitude for the long, painful journey that had brought them to this moment. This broken, reconstructed, beautifully unconventional family that had been forged from loss and built with love. If you believe in second chances, in the power of choosing love over fear, in families that are built rather than born, then please join this community. Hit that subscribe button because these stories matter. Your engagement helps us share more stories of hope, more reminders that healing is possible, that people can change, that love finds a way. Leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from, and if this story touched you, share how. We're building something beautiful here together. One story, one connection, one choice at a time. The journey from that first desperate night, when Jason fired his seventh maid and felt his world collapsing, to this moment of quiet happiness, had been long and painful. It had required Jason to confront every prejudice he'd been raised with, every fear he'd hidden behind, every way he'd chosen success over presence. It had required Celine to risk her heart again after it had been broken so many times, to trust that this time might be different, to believe she deserved a place in a world that had spent her whole life telling her she didn't belong. And it had required George to do the hardest thing of all, to trust humans again after the most important human in his life had disappeared, to slowly, painfully, rebuild connections in a world that felt dangerous and overwhelming. But they'd done it. Together, they'd created something that defied expectations and social conventions. They'd built a family not from blood but from choice, not from genetics but from grace, not from what society said was proper but from what their hearts knew was right. George would always be autistic. That would never change, and they didn't want it to. His autism was part of who he was, inseparable from his identity, the source of both his challenges and his unique way of seeing beauty in patterns most people overlooked. He might never be fully verbal, might always need support navigating a world not designed for him. And that was okay. He was already complete, already valuable, already worthy of love and celebration. Celine would carry her scars from foster care, from losing Marcus, from all the times the world had told her she wasn't enough. But those scars had shaped her into someone capable of extraordinary compassion. Someone who understood that the most broken people often have the most to give if someone will just see them. And Jason would always regret the time he'd lost with Sarah, the moments he'd missed with George, the ways he'd prioritized the wrong things for too many years. But he was learning that guilt could either paralyze you or propel you forward. He chose forward. Every day, he chose to show up, be present, do better. Their story wasn't a fairy tale. There was no magic cure, no overnight transformation, no moment when everything suddenly became easy. Healing was messy and slow and full of setbacks. But it was real. And real was better than perfect. They were three people who'd been broken in different ways, finding wholeness not by fixing each other but by accepting each other, by choosing every single day to show up for the hard work of loving someone exactly as they were. That's the truth about family. It's not about perfection or convention or meeting society's expectations. It's about showing up, being present, choosing love over fear, fighting for each other even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. It's about understanding that the people who save us often come from unexpected places. That worth has nothing to do with credentials or wealth or social standing. That the most profound connections are built from vulnerability and courage and the willingness to be changed by each other. Jason had been a billionaire who could buy anything except the one thing that mattered: connection with his son. Celine had been poor in resources but rich in understanding, carrying wisdom earned through survival. George had been a child locked in silence, waiting for someone patient enough to learn his language. Together, they became something none of them could have been alone. They became family. Real, imperfect, beautiful family. And in the end, that was everything. We'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Has this story touched something in your own journey? Do you believe in chosen family, in second chances, in the power of love to transcend society's barriers? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story matters. Your voice matters. You matter. And if this story reminded you of that truth, then it served its purpose. Thank you for being here, for opening your heart to George and Jason and Celine's journey. May you find the courage to build your own beautiful, unconventional family, whatever that looks like for you.